So for almost 4 years now, I've been thinking about fire effects on pollinators and pollination. Why? Well, for about 90% of the Earth's flowering plants to reproduce sexually, they require animals to transport pollen from the male parts of flowers to the female parts of flowers. A number of countries are experiencing pollinator declines as a result of land use intensification, climate change, alien species, and pests and pathogens. When plants lose their pollinators, sexual seed production fails, eventually leading to local extinction unless they possess other means of reproduction such as self-pollination or vegetative reproduction. But even then, they may suffer reduced genetic diversity and inbreeding depression. So that's why it's important to study pollination, but why fire and pollination? We know very little about how fire and pollination interact. A handful of studies from the Mediterranean basin, South Africa, and North America have found that fire can structure pollinator communities by altering the distribution of floral and nesting resources. A similar number of studies from the same regions have investigated fire effects on plant-pollinator interactions in terms of pollinator visitation to flowers, pollen deposition on flowers, and seed production. And all of these studies have found evidence of such effects. So the little work that has been done suggests it's worth further investigating these interactions and thinking about how they might be integrated into and extend fire management. So the aim of my thesis was to better understand fire effects on pollinators and pollination and their role in fire management for biodiversity conservation. In terms of fire management, I focused on the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, where they've recently sought to build on the management of threatened and vulnerable species to include management of ecosystem stability as a whole. I initially started thinking about fire effects on pollination in terms of managing threatened species, but I've since come to see how these effects might be relevant to ecosystem stability. So my presentation today will follow this sort of trajectory. I'll try to make some specific management recommendations along the way, but the discussion is focused more on where an understanding of fire effects on pollinators and pollination might fit into fire management for biodiversity conservation. Of my research chapters, chapter 1 is a conceptual model of plant-pollinator interactions in fire-prone landscapes that I think is a good way of thinking about these interactions from a management point of view. I won't spend much time talking on it because it's been published and doesn't have any data, so it's a bit boring. Research chapter 2 has also been published, but I'll spend more time talking about this because it contains the most interesting findings of my thesis. Research chapter 3 I'll mention only briefly because it's based on a limited data set salvaged from a field season gone wrong. And in research chapter 4, I shift focus away from specific plant-pollinator interactions to the pollinator community, and this is where I start talking about ecosystem stability. Oops. An important first step in bringing plant-pollinator interactions into fire management is figuring out how fire's effects on these interactions should be conceptualized in a way that's useful to managers. Choosing a fire management strategy that is most likely to avoid species extinctions is difficult given the long timescales relevant to population persistence. So simulation models based on known fire responses of plants and animals have been advocated and increasingly used to predict the consequences and effectiveness of alternative fire management strategies on fire regimes and, in turn, biodiversity. So the landscape is typically conceived of as a grid. Each cell has a fire history that either increases or is burnt and returns to zero in each time step, depending on fire ignition and spread between cells. The fire age of each cell determines its habitat suitability for animals and demographic characteristics for plants such as seed production. As fire age changes between time steps, cell occupancy changes according to habitat suitability and demographic processes, as well as dispersal from neighbouring cells. So the question is, how might an understanding of fire effects on pollinators and pollination be integrated into and extend this? In the existing framework, seed production in each cell is typically assumed to occur when the cell reaches a particular fire age, usually corresponding to the onset of post-fire flowering. However, pollinator visitation and seed production can vary substantially following post-fire flowering. For instance, when pollinator recovery is slower than flower recovery. So this suggests that a more accurate conceptualization of plant population dynamics would allow reproduction in each cell to vary as a function of pollination services to the cell. About 10 years ago, Kremen and colleagues came up with this conceptual model of pollination services in heterogeneous landscapes. Basically, it says that land use, management, and disturbance can influence pollination by altering the pollinator community, because obviously you need pollinators for pollination, and because pollinators influence each other's foraging behaviour. The plant community, because different flowering species can work together to attract and support pollinators or can compete for pollination. And the target plant to which pollination services are provided, because different flowering individuals of the same species can also work together to attract and support pollinators or compete for them. Note also the inclusion of local and landscape scales. This indicates that the different processes influencing pollination can operate over different spatial scales. So, for instance, pollination services to the target plant might be influenced both by the landscape scale distribution of pollinator habitat and by the local flower community helping to attract pollinators. Empirical work suggests this multi-scale understanding is key to predicting pollination services in heterogeneous landscapes. So I've tried to bring it into the existing grid-based model of population dynamics and came up with this. I won't go into all the detail, but basically in each time step, there is a map of pollinator abundance based on the distribution of pollinator habitat across the landscape according to relationships between floral and nesting resources and fire history. There's also a map of pollination services to the plants in each cell based on the pollinator source map and the cell's fire history as it relates to local processes. So within each cell in this pollination services map, there's a plant-pollinator interaction network composed of the plants flowering in the cell, as determined by the cell's fire history, and the pollinators residing in the cell or visiting from neighbouring cells in the surrounding landscape, as determined by the pollinator source map. The local scale processes are then the behavioural responses of the pollinators in each network to the other pollinator and plant species in the network. The outcome of each network in each cell for each plant species is seed production, and for each pollinator species is the floral resource value, which then feeds into the next pollinator source map to combine with nesting resources and determine the distribution of pollinator habitat. Now, the problem with this model is that while lots of work in agricultural and urban landscapes has supported this notion of multiple processes operating over different spatial scales, all of the previous work investigating plant-pollinator interactions in fire-prone landscapes has ignored the possibility of multiple spatial scales. They all measured flower abundance, pollinator abundance, and pollination at a number of different locations in the landscape and related these measurements to the post-fire age class of each sample location. This data isn't very useful for evaluating or parameterizing the grid-based model I just described, because while it might give us some information about the relationships between pollination in each cell and the cell's fire history, it doesn't tell us much about the relationships between pollination in each cell and the fire histories of neighbouring cells in the surrounding landscape when there's heterogeneity at these larger spatial scales. So I did some empirical work attempting to address this. I collected all of my data from heathy woodlands in southwest Victoria. Successional changes occur over decades in these woodlands, so I used the space for time substitution design, where I had 60 different sites with different fire histories across the landscape. Post-fire age classes were defined according to Cheel's growth stages, as these are currently used for fire management in Victoria, allowing me to assess the suitability of the existing classification system, which was initially derived for plant communities, for pollinators and their interactions with plants. So each patch of heathly woodland in the study landscape, like this one here, was divided into grids of 40 by 40 metre cells, and each cell was assigned to one of the 5 age classes according to its recorded fire history. At each sample location, I then recorded its fire age and the proportion of land covered by each fire age within some fixed distance of sample locations, with this distance varying between chapters depending on the questions being addressed. So in my second research chapter, I looked at whether there might be multiple processes operating over different spatial scales through which fire influences the interaction between the native orchid Caladinia tentaculata and its wasp pollinator Phinoides puginatus. I chose this species because it's an example of a potentially fragile pollination system. You can see the orchid in the middle here about to receive a visit from a male wasp that's being deceived into thinking this flower is a female wasp that it can mate with. And this sexual deception is the means by which around 160 Australian orchid species achieve pollination. These relationships are highly specialised, meaning that a given orchid species is typically pollinated by a single wasp species, and susceptibility to pollination failure is thought to increase with the degree of specialisation of the pollination system, because decline in one pollinator species can only be compensated when other pollinator species are available. Moreover, the pollinators of these orchids are typically parasitoid wasps that tend to specialise on one or few insect hosts, and so similarly susceptible to changes in host populations. And the critically threatened status of a number of these sexually deceptive orchids has been attributed to these multiple interacting partners, but the effects of fire on these interactions are presently unknown. So I was interested in how pollination of this orchid might change with fire age, because there was potential for multiple processes to operate. The orchid can flower across succession, but is usually particularly abundant in the first few post-fire years, so fire might influence pollination by altering the number of conspecific flowers attracting pollinators. Fire might also alter the distribution of pollinator resources. The orchid provides no nectar, so the wasps have to obtain floral resources from other species, usually Lepispermum or other Metaceae, and these can take several years to return to pre-fire flowering levels. The wasps parasitise the larvae of scarab beetles, and successional changes in scarab abundance have been observed, but data are scarce. So I investigated relationships between visitation to the orchid and fire age measured at multiple spatial scales, and between the adult scarabs, because the larvae were too difficult to sample, and fire age at the landscape scale. My response variables were the number of pollinator visits to 4 potted Caladinia tentaculata flowers and the number of scarab beetles captured in flight intercept traps. So at each of the sample locations in the study landscape, I placed the orchid flowers and counted the number of wasps visiting them and set up these traps that captured the scarab beetles. My predictive variables were the age class of each sample location and a proportion of each age class within 500 metres of each sample location, as this approximates the maximum known flight range of thin-eyed wasps. I found that at the local scale, visitation was greatest when the sample location was recently burnt, but not significantly so compared to when the sample location was very long unburnt. To compare the effects of fire age at landscape scales, I constructed 5 models, each with a single predictor corresponding to the proportion of land covered by a particular age class. Compared these models in terms of evidence ratios relative to a null model with an intercept only, parameter estimates and R-squared values, and found that the proportion of land covered by the oldest age class provided the best explanation of wasp visitation. I made similar comparisons of landscape models with the scarab beetles as responses, and in this case found that the proportion of land covered by the second oldest age class provided the best explanation of variation in scarab abundance. Finally, I looked at whether the effects on wasp visitation of fire age at local and landscape scales were additive or interactive. The local scale effect was represented by a binary predictor that was 1 when the sample location was in the youngest age class and 0 when it was in any other age class. And the landscape scale effect was represented by the proportion of land covered by the oldest age class. I calculated the evidence ratio for the additive compared to interactive combination of these predictors and found that the interactive model was 300 times more likely than the additive and explained 40% of the variation in wasp visitation. The interaction was highly significant, and the positive effect of long unburnt vegetation in the surrounding landscape was greatest when the sample location was recently burnt. So potentially what's going on is that scarab populations peak at about 36 to 50 years, followed soon by their enemy, the wasp, that then suppresses scarab populations, causing a reduction in the number of adults emerging and being captured in my traps. And the wasps then visit the orchid predominantly in the recently burned environment. So at the landscape scale, fire appears to influence visitation to this orchid by altering the distribution of pollinator habitat, but this requires further investigation. At the local scale, it may be that the larger number of flowers in the recently burned environment create a stronger signal to the wasps, but this also requires further investigation. The main point is that there appear to be multiple processes through which fire influences visitation to the orchid, and these processes appear to operate over different spatial scales. So fire management strategies that more often create this sort of spatial arrangement would be expected to promote population persistence of this orchid, assuming that high visitation translates into higher seed production. In the third research chapter, I try to take this next step of relating seed production for a number of orchid species to local landscape factors, but it ended up being a really dry growing and flowering season, and most of the flowers I was monitoring wilted or were eaten. All I managed to salvage was enough data for simple models of seed production of this species, Diuris pardina, as a function of fire age in the floral community measured at local spatial scales. Pollination of this orchid is expected to depend on the floral abundance of one or more of these Fabaceae species, because the orchid is thought to attract pollinators not by providing a reward, but instead by mimicking the shape and spectral reflectance of these rewarding flowers. With my limited data, I found that while there was an effect of fire age on Fabaceae floral abundance, there was no evidence for an effect of fire age or floral abundance on Diuris seed set. The only significant driver of seed set that I recorded was rainfall, with the probability of seed set declining with growing and flowering season rainfall. While this is disappointing in the context of my PhD, it's interesting in its own right, because while orchids are generally, seed production of orchids is generally limited by pollination, in this case it appeared to be limited more by rainfall in winter and spring, which is expected to decline in my study landscape in coming decades. In research chapter 4, I did something a bit different, focusing just on the pollinator community, but still continuing with the theme of determining the spatial scales at which fire might influence pollinators and pollination. Since the fire history conditions under which the habitat requirements of animals are met can vary between species, landscapes containing a diversity of fire histories are thought to support a diversity of animal species. This is the idea underlying the management practice of patch mosaic burning that aims to create landscape mosaics of post-fire age classes to cater for the varying needs of a diversity of animal species. Species diversity is desirable because there is a growing body of empirical work describing positive relationships between species diversity and ecosystem stability, which is generally thought to occur when different species contributing to a given ecosystem function, such as pollination, differ in their responses to environmental variation. So as we saw before, decline in one pollinator species can be compensated when other pollinator species are available. Now, immobile plants flowering at particular locations in the landscape are most likely to experience the stabilizing effects of pollinator diversity when that diversity exists at each location, because decline in one pollinator species can't be compensated by other pollinator species when they're in different parts of the landscape. So fire age diversity is most likely to stabilize pollination when it creates local pollinator diversity. And the key to this may be the spatial scale at which fire age is heterogeneous. When fire age tends to be homogeneous within pollinator movement range of each plant's location, there may be fewer pollinator species available to visit each plant compared to when fire age tends to be heterogeneous within movement range of each location. So I looked at whether local pollinator species diversity increased with fire age diversity within pollinator movement range of sample locations. But since movement ranges can vary substantially between species within pollinator communities, I tested for effects of fire age measured at multiple spatial scales. So these traps I had set up in the landscape catching scarab beetles, caught all kinds of aerial invertebrates, a subsection of which were pollinators. I didn't catch many bees, which at first might seem like a problem because when most people think of pollinators, they think of bees. But that was okay because I caught thousands of flies and wasps, which are the unsung heroes of the pollinator world. And I think it's important for people to learn to associate flies with flowers because while they are ugly, annoying little pests, they pollinate many wild plants and crops and so bring beauty and food into the world through their ugly little sensory systems. My response variables were the number of individuals of each species and the number of species. My predictive variables at local scales were the age class of each sample location and a number of different habitat variables measured within 40 meters of each sample location to try to get a sense of which habitat variables might underlie species fire responses and whether species differed in their habitat preferences such that sites containing a diversity of habitat conditions might support a diversity of species. And at the landscape scale, my predictive variables were the proportion of land covered by each age class within 200, 400, or 800 meters of sample locations. I won't present all the results, just enough to give you a picture of what's going on. This ordination diagram on the left shows that the proportion of land within 200 meters covered by the youngest and two oldest age classes has statistically significant effects, but collectively explained only 10% of the variation in community composition. So some braconid wasps and houseflies were associated with recently burnt vegetation, bee flies and some ichneumoniid wasps with vegetation burnt between 36 and 50 years ago, and fungus gnats and some other houseflies with vegetation burnt greater than 50 years ago. And I'll just mention that I've shown the fungus gnat here, which you probably can't even see, visiting this pterostylis orchid, which has recently been shown to depend solely on this fungus gnat for pollination through sexual deception. So very long unburnt vegetation may be important for another highly specialized orchid, as it appeared to be for Caladinia tentaculata in my second chapter. On the right, there are some single predictor regression models for some of the taxa with the strongest responses. Bee flies were positively associated with bare ground, which makes sense because they parasitize soil-dwelling larvae. The fungus gnats, and they exhibited their strongest response to fire at the larger spatial scale. Fungus gnats were negatively associated with bare ground, which also makes sense because bare ground implies a lack of the leaf litter and logs carrying the fungi that the gnats consume, and they exhibited their strongest response to fire at the local scale. Hoverflies exhibited similar responses to the gnats, but were less specialized and less sensitive to fire. So in general, relationships were moderate or weak, suggesting that the existing age class classification scheme might not be appropriate for many of the fly and wasp species in my study landscape. There was some evidence of between species variation in habitat and fire age preferences and in movement ranges. So from the moderate and weak abundance relationships, we might expect moderate or weak relationships between fire age and species diversity, perhaps at multiple spatial scales. And this was what I found. The best model of species richness was 71 times more likely than the null, explained a moderate amount of variation, and contained a positive effect of local habitat diversity, a negative effect of fire age diversity within 200 metres, and a positive effect of fire age diversity within 800 metres. I've just shown the contrasting effects of fire age diversity at 200, 800 metres here, which, because the relationships weren't particularly strong, could just be due to chance, but it's interesting nonetheless because it suggests that more species might be available at each location when fire age tends to be heterogeneous within 800 metres, but tends to be homogeneous within 200 metres. And this may influence stability of pollination services to plants pollinated by flies and wasps, but this remains to be tested. So to finish up, in the introduction, I said the aim of my thesis was to better understand fire effects on pollinators and pollination and their role in fire management for biodiversity conservation. In chapter 1, I outlined the conceptual framework that I thought would achieve this. It took the existing grid-based model of population dynamics and combined it with the existing spatially explicit model of pollination services to produce this grid-based model of population dynamics with demographic processes determined by plant-pollinator interactions. But the problem was that the existing pollination model was based entirely on work from agricultural and urban landscapes, so we didn't know whether the same dynamics applied in fire-prone landscapes. Specifically, no studies had investigated whether fire could influence plant-pollinator interactions through multiple processes operating over different spatial scales. Chapter 2 suggests it can, though I only investigated one plant species and one pollinator species. Chapter 4 also provides some evidence of fire effects at multiple spatial scales, but less directly because I didn't measure plant-pollinator interactions. And about 2 months ago, this North American study was published, describing strong positive relationships between landscape fire heterogeneity, local bee species diversity, and the number of interactions between, the number of plant and bee species interacting, though only when local fire severity had been low or moderate. So further evidence that when we're looking for fire effects on pollination, we should consider multiple spatial scales simultaneously. And that this sort of empirical data might be used to parameterize simulation models based on this conceptual model of population dynamics under alternative fire management strategies. By focusing on the plant species most likely to experience population decline following loss of pollination services, so those that have specialized pollination systems, are self-incompatible or lack the capacity for vegetative reproduction. These simulations could be used to identify species that might be vulnerable under particular fire regimes. Moving toward managing ecosystem stability, which currently focuses on determining the proportion of the landscape that should be covered by each age class in order to maximize species diversity, it may be necessary to determine the spatial scales at which this fire age diversity needs to be created in order to promote the species interactions that often underlie the stabilizing effects of biodiversity. No studies have yet looked at whether the local pollinator diversity that fire can create reduces variability in pollination and ultimately seed production. And finally, there's another, though related form of stability that deserves investigation. There are emergent properties of community-level plant-pollinator interactions, such as nestedness, which is a measure of the degree to which species specialists interact with, a subset of the species that generalists interact with. Theoretical and some empirical work suggests that these properties are related to the resilience of entire plant-pollinator communities to extinction cascades following initial species loss. So these metrics could be monitored and simulated in addition to species abundance and diversity. And that's it. Thank you to my supervisors, Alan, Fiona and Mick, for fieldwork, Julio, Dad and John. Again, Julio and Amanda for too many hours on the microscope. For helpful chats, Julian, Tom, Holly, Helen Bron, Matt Swan. I should include Matt Chick so he doesn't feel left out, but you didn't really help me, did you? Delp for funding and all these Delp people for advice and field support. And finally, Simi for putting up with my student bum lifestyle for how many years it's been. So thank you.
That's great, Julian. He really did leave the student lifestyle. He's the only student I've known who actually saved money while he was on a postgraduate scholarship. So now is the time to splash out, I think. I'm sure we have some questions from the audience to start with. Kevin.
Julian, that was a fantastic presentation, and your research is a really valuable piece of work, so congratulate you for that. A question I got, I guess, is the way in which you've envisaged fire, and you've looked at patchiness across the landscape of burnt, unburnt, but within the so-called burnt, there's a massive variation in the severity of that burn, so whether or not the soil is heated, for example, whether or not there's a leaf scorch and so on. I would have thought that that would have a large impact on your pollinators and the agents you've got as well. Do you just consider that to be background noise, or is that something that would potentially have a big impact on the results that you've come up with, rather than just being burnt, unburnt? The severity of the burn has its own sort of heterogeneity as well, and may impact the dynamics that you're looking at. Just interested in your comment.
Yeah, I think burn severity could have been very important, and I would have liked to have looked at it. For instance, I was talking about how the orchids flower predominantly in the recently burned environment, but that is probably only after fires of particular severities. Also, you know, the pollinators, because they're parasitizing the beetle larvae that are underground, particularly severe fires, might have heat penetrating deep enough to burn and kill the larvae, or, you know, less severe fires may leave them unscathed. So yeah, I think fire severity could be very important, and it's unfortunate I didn't really get a chance to look at it. But with my empirical work, I had some information on at least the fire season, and so potentially severity of the recent fires anyway. And they all occurred in sort of late spring, early summer. So would have been of probably of a similar severity, and so might not have introduced too much variation. But yeah, it's unfortunate I didn't get to look at that.
It's more a general question about studying short-term processes for one season. And you said in that one chapter that the season was so dry that you couldn't even do what you set out to do. So you used your data very wisely and got something out of there. But how big do you think is the risk that you get a very untypical result, or that the result for the interactions you're looking at would be very different in a wetter season, or even turn around completely?
Yeah. So with the third chapter, I think that could have been a problem as well. If it had been a wetter season and seed set wasn't limited by rainfall, then maybe I would have found an effect of, fire age or the floral community on pollination. So, those results aren't very solid. You need to do it over, a decent number of years. So perhaps you get variation in rainfall, and then you can account for that and see whether there's an effect on pollination in seasons when it's not limited by rainfall. Yeah.
Yeah, Julian. Thinking about chapter 4, you used species richness as your multi-species index.
Mm-hmm.
Did you play around with other multi-species indices as well?
No, I didn't. If I had more time, that is probably something that I would do. Yeah.
Okay, something we've been finding in some of our other work is that species richness can be a bit of a limited variable from time to time, and using other indices, maybe diversity indices, or maybe even a functional diversity indice might reveal more information, different information.
I might have a chat with you about that actually, because I could do further work on this chapter. It hasn't been submitted yet, so yeah.
Julian, just from what you've learned from the experience that you've been through and so on, what would be the likelihood if you were to do a genetic analysis of the, say, the orchids that you're looking at, reflecting the pollination history in terms of the genetic diversity that's captured in the genetic material of the seeds? Would you be able to potentially see the perhaps changing history or not of the degree of pollination and genetic diversity? So you started off saying that genetic diversity is one of the important aspects here. If you were to look at that genetic diversity directly rather than the processes that you're looking at here, would that actually give you any insights? Have you got any thoughts about that for the next PhD that someone else comes along to do?
That's a really interesting question, and I hadn't thought about that at all. But just off the top of my head, as I was saying, the orchids flower mostly in the recently burnt environment. If you go into a recently burnt site, sometimes you can stand in one spot and see more than 100 orchids. And so in that sort of situation, each orchid might be breeding with more closely related orchids compared to in older vegetation when they're less dense, because they produce really thousands of seeds once they've been pollinated, and a lot of those seeds fall within a few meters of the orchid. And so there's probably some relationship between the distance between orchid individuals and their relatedness. And so in the recently burnt environment, when there are so many related individuals flowering, there might be more mating between related individuals compared to in older successional stages. But beyond that, I don't know. But yeah, interesting question. Thanks.
Do we have any more tricky, interesting questions? Champion, Scarab, Larvae, Digger, Julio.
Hello, Julian. Nice presentation. Congratulations again for finishing your PhD. I just have curiosity regarding one point you mentioned. Then Calladenia must have some research in the future regarding which kind of signs. Hello? You hear me? Hello, Julian. Congratulations for your presentation. Regarding the signs, then Calladenia used to attract the pollinators and must be part of the future research. Which kind of signs do you think must be part of the research? If, like the mimic and not flowers, like chemical signs?
So sorry, what's the question exactly? Like, how would we further investigate these pollination systems?
Which kind of signs that Calladenia potentially used to attract pollinators?
Oh, sorry, signs, yeah. So from a distance, they use an odor to attract the pollinators. And this odor is, it mimics the sex pheromone of female wasps. And not in Caladinia, but in some other sexually deceptive species, Carloglottis, they've actually isolated what this molecule is exactly, and then they can take that molecule out into the wild and it attracts all the wasps, and it's identical to the one that the female wasps produce. So yeah, it's an olfactory sign in this particular example, and maybe there's some visual stuff as they get in close, because on the labellum of the orchid, there are all these little purple sort of hair-like things sticking up that, you know, maybe look like the back of a female wasp. And yeah.
Do you think Caladinia also mimic another flowers?
Some Caladinia probably do, yeah. So one of the species I was trying to monitor that wilted, Caladinia, I can't remember which one it is, Carnea, I think. So it's either a generalist food deceptive plant, so it just has floral cues, floral signals that pollinators will have, you know, innate responses to, or it's a more specific mimic of particular plant species, like Diuris pardina was a specific mimic of the Fabaceae flowers. If that answers your question, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
One last question from the audience, perhaps. Riley, do we go online ones? Right, well, I'd like you all to join with me in thanking Julian for a fantastic presentation and congratulating him on finishing his work.